In just 4 years, American factories built almost 300,000 aircraft, more than 2 million military vehicles, roughly 86,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and thousands of ships that carried troops and supplies across entire oceans. That kind of output doesn't sound real, especially when you remember that these machines were not coming from secret military factories hidden in the desert. They were coming from the same industrial system that had been making cars, refrigerators, sewing machines, and household tools only a few years earlier. It sounds fake, but it isn't. And the reason it was possible is because everyday American companies were suddenly pulled into the largest production effort in human history. Once the decision was made to turn civilian factories into war factories, the first problem was obvious. Soldiers needed to get to the battlefield, and once they got there, they needed machines. That meant the transformation had to start with transportation. And in America, transportation meant one thing above all else: cars. Detroit was already built around speed and repetition. Before the war, American factories produced more than 3 million civilian cars per year. But once wartime production finally ramped up, nearly every major assembly line was converted to military use. Across the entire conflict, American factories made only about 139 civilian cars, because the assembly lines had been repurposed for tanks, trucks, engines, and aircrafts instead. Ford's Willow Run plant became the most famous symbol of transformation. Designed as a single continuous assembly line nearly a mile long, where parts flowed forward relentlessly and workers repeated the same task thousands of times per week, the factory treated heavy bombers the way it once treated Model Ts. By 1944, Willow Run was completing a fully assembled B-24 Liberator bomber roughly every 60 minutes, 24 hours a day. By war's end, that one facility alone had built more than 8,000 B-24s, far more than any other heavy bomber factory in the world. But while Ford wowed the world with aircraft output, another American industrial giant became the backbone that kept the whole war machine moving. General Motors, a company most Americans still thought of as that car company from commercials, became the single largest producer of war material in the United States by contract value. GM didn't focus on one headline-grabbing product. It became a machine of machines. GM factories stamped out hundreds of thousands of military trucks and jeeps, essential for moving troops and equipment across continents. They produced tank engines and transmissions that powered armored divisions from North Africa to Normandy. They built aircraft engines that turned bombers and fighters into reliable weapons of war. GM factories also turned out machine guns, electrical components, and mechanical parts in the millions, feeding nearly every branch of the armed forces. Where Ford's contributions showed up on runways and bomber squadrons, GM's showed up everywhere. What made GM especially dangerous as a wartime producer was not just volume but flexibility. Different GM divisions were producing entirely different categories of equipment at the same time, allowing the company to respond to shifting battlefield needs almost immediately. If tank losses spiked in Europe, transmission and engine production could be increased. If aircraft losses climbed in the Pacific, factories already building civilian engines could be converted to aviation models. That adaptability meant GM was not just feeding the war machine, it was helping steer it. GM also became one of the largest producers of military trucks, which sounds less dramatic than bombers or tanks, but was arguably just as important. Armies move on logistics, and trucks moved everything, including fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement troops. Entire offenses depended on supply convoys that stretched for miles, and many of those vehicles carried GM parts under their hoods. Without that constant stream of transport, even the most powerful armored units would have stalled far from their objectives. This made GM less visible in wartime headlines, but absolutely critical behind the scenes. Battles might be won by tanks and aircraft, but campaigns were sustained by engines, transmissions, and spare parts. And those were exactly the kinds of systems GM specialized in producing at massive scale. In sheer industrial value, GM was the largest weapons manufacturer in the world during the war, and it did so without ever making a single civilian car for the entire conflict. Chrysler's contribution was different, but equally critical. While Ford and GM operated massive multi-product factories, Chrysler was tasked with heavy weapons and armor production, including the tanks and anti-aircraft guns that defended ground troops and cities. At the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, Chrysler oversaw the mass production of tens of thousands of armored vehicles and redesigned assembly methods so efficiently that complex artillery systems, once requiring hundreds of labor hours, could eventually be completed in a fraction of that time. This increase in efficiency meant more weapons hitting front lines sooner, shortening supply chain delays, and accelerating Allied advances across both Europe and the Pacific. Together, these three companies, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, did more than just shift gears from cars to war machines. They rewrote the industrial rulebook, proving that American mass production could be adapted to build not only appliances and automobiles, but the essential machinery of war itself. And while these vehicles and weapons multiplied, another problem became clear. Getting machines to the front was only half the battle. If ships and planes were going to survive combat, they needed power systems, communications, and early warning technology that could operate in conditions far harsher than anything found in civilian life. That is when the war began to depend even more on companies that once put light bulbs and washers into American homes. Once vehicles and weapons began pouring out of auto plants, the war effort ran into its next bottleneck. Machines could get to the front, but without reliable power systems, navigation equipment, and early warning technologies, these machines were dangerously vulnerable. Planes needed dependable engines and electrical systems. Ships needed turbines and communications gear. And armies needed ways to detect enemies before they were already under attack. That demand pulled in companies that had built their reputations powering American homes. General Electric had spent decades producing motors, generators, and household electrical equipment. But during the war, it became one of the largest producers of aircraft engines and electrical systems in the country. GE manufactured tens of thousands of aircraft engines along with generators, wiring systems, and control components used in bombers, fighters, and naval vessels. Those engines powered planes that flew bombing runs over Europe and carrier operations in the Pacific, turning home appliance engineering into airborne firepower. Westinghouse, another household electrical giant, focused heavily on naval technology and radar. Its factories produced turbines used in warships and submarines, as well as radar systems that allowed Allied forces to detect enemy aircraft and ships long before visual contact was possible. Radar transformed naval warfare, making surprise attacks harder to pull off and allowing fleets to coordinate movements across open oceans. What had once been laboratory science was now mass-produced industrial equipment installed on thousands of ships. These companies also supplied the electrical control systems that ran ship engines, powered gun turrets, and stabilized navigation instruments. Factories that once wired refrigerators and now radios were now wiring destroyers, transport ships, and bombers that operated under constant vibration, shock, and extreme weather. Failure was not an inconvenience anymore. It was fatal. As vehicles, ships, and aircraft became more advanced, their parts had to become more precise. Electrical failures, engine misalignments, and faulty gauges could ground entire squadrons. And that level of precision required manufacturers who specialized not in size or speed, but in consistency, which is how sewing machines and office equipment ended up playing a role in modern warfare. Singer was famous for one thing: sewing machines that could operate smoothly for decades without failure. That reliability depended on tight tolerances, perfectly aligned parts, and strict quality control. Those same qualities were exactly what the military needed for weapons and aircraft instruments. During the war, Singer factories produced thousands of M1911 pistols along with precision components used in aircraft and military equipment. The company's expertise in fine metal machining allowed it to shift from household devices to weapons that had to function flawlessly in mud, sand, and extreme cold. In wartime production, it turned out that making needles line up perfectly was not that different from making firing mechanisms work under combat conditions. IBM's contribution looked nothing like a weapon, but without it, many of those weapons would never have reached the battlefield at all. World War II produced an overwhelming amount of data. Millions of soldiers, constant troop movements, supply shipments crossing oceans, maintenance schedules, and training records all had to be tracked and updated continuously. IBM's punch card machines processed enormous volumes of military data, allowing planners to manage supply chains that stretched across continents. These machines helped determine where equipment was needed, which units were undersupplied, and how fast replacement parts could be delivered. In many ways, IBM helped create the logical nervous system of the Allied war effort, turning information into a weapon of coordination and speed. But all of this machinery and organization fed into one relentless reality. The faster armies moved and fought, the faster they burned through fuel and ammunition. Artillery shells, bombs, lubricants, and medical supplies were being consumed at rates far higher than pre-war estimates had predicted. To keep that flow moving, the war now depended on chemistry. DuPont had built its business on industrial chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials, but during World War II, it became one of the largest producers of explosives in the world. Its factories supplied massive quantities of gunpowder and high explosives that filled artillery shells, aerial bombs, and naval munitions used across every front of the war. Without that steady stream of explosives, even the most powerful artillery and bombing campaigns would have gone silent. But DuPont's role extended far beyond conventional weapons. The company was heavily involved in building and operating plutonium production facilities for the Manhattan Project. Placing civilian chemical engineers at the center of the atomic weapons program, entire production complexes in secret towns were constructed to support this effort, staffed by tens of thousands of workers who often had no idea what the materials they handled were ultimately being used for. At its peak, the Manhattan Project employed well over 100,000 100,000 people across multiple states, most of whom had no idea what they were building or why security was so extreme. Workers were assigned to single repetitive tasks, sometimes for years, without ever seeing the finished product. The system was designed to protect secrecy, but it also reflected how industrialized, even scientific research had become. Building an atomic bomb was no longer just about scientists in laboratories. It was about massive production schedules, material quotas, and industrial coordination on a national scale. DuPont's role in this process showed how far civilian industry had been absorbed into military planning. Chemical engineers who once worked on plastics and paints were now solving problems related to radioactive materials, reactor cooling systems, and large-scale material purification. It was a fusion of corporate manufacturing and theoretical physics that had never existed before, and it permanently changed how governments approached large scientific projects after the war. Many workers followed strict instructions without knowing they were contributing to the most destructive weapons ever created. Their daily tasks looked industrial and routine, but the consequences would reshape global politics for generations. At the same time, Procter Gamble, a company most people associated with soap and household cleaning products, supplied huge quantities of glycerin, a critical ingredient in explosives. P&G also produced hygiene products essential for troop health. In combat zones, disease could spread rapidly, and poor sanitation could disable units as effectively as enemy fire. Soap, disinfectants, and medical supplies became essential parts of military readiness. Fuel additives, lubricants, plastics, medical chemicals, and explosives all flowed from civilian chemical plants into military supply depots. Without those materials, engines seized, weapons malfunctioned, and soldiers grew sick. War was not just steel and fire, it was chemistry in an industrial scale. But even with factories humming and supply chains stabilized, production would have collapsed without one final critical resource: people. As millions of men left for military service, American factories faced an immediate labor crisis. Production targets were climbing, but the workforce that had once filled assembly lines was shrinking. To keep factories operating, companies turned to a workforce that had been largely excluded from heavy industry before the war. Women entered manufacturing in unprecedented numbers, eventually filling millions of industrial jobs. They welded ship hulls, assembled aircraft fuselages, machined engine parts, and inspected weapons components. Many learned complex technical skills in a matter of weeks, then worked 12-hour shifts in loud, dangerous environments under constant production pressure. Accidents were common, and safety standards often lagged behind the pace of production. Workers dealt with heavy machinery, toxic chemicals, and intense noise levels, sometimes without modern protective equipment. Fatigue became one of the biggest threats in both productivity and personal safety, especially on overnight shifts where mistakes could cost fingers, limbs, or lives. Despite this, absenteeism was treated as a serious offense. Workers were constantly reminded that slowing down production could mean shortages at the front. Morale campaigns filled factories with posters, slogans, and announcements linking individual output directly to battlefield success. Workers were encouraged to think of every completed part as something that might protect a soldier overseas. That psychological connection kept many people going through exhaustion, personal loss, and long stretches without time off. The factory floor became both a workplace and a morale front. where emotional endurance mattered almost as much as technical skill. Factories operated around the clock. Shift whistles replaced church bells as the sound that structured daily life in many towns. Housing shortages appeared near major plants. Public transportation systems were expanded and entire communities reorganized around production schedules. Families adjusted to rotating shifts, blackout drills, and rationing, all while sending loved ones overseas. Production targets were treated as military objectives. Falling behind schedule was not a business issue. It was framed as a threat to soldiers at the front. Every delay meant fewer vehicles, fewer weapons, and fewer supplies reaching active combat zones. This workforce turned engineering plans into reality. Every tank, bomber, radar system, and artillery shell began as human labor before it became military hardware. Millions of Americans who never wore uniforms were still fighting the war every day through exhaustion, repetition, and industrial discipline. And when the war finally ended, the machines did not stop. They simply changed what they were built to make. The industrial systems perfected under wartime pressure were quickly redirected towards civilian life. Factories that had learned how to maximize speed, efficiency, and quality control now applied those methods to customer goods. Automobiles, appliances, televisions, and home construction all benefited from production techniques refined during the war. Suburban expansion followed transportation routes originally built for military logistics. The middle class grew rapidly, supported by employment opportunities and government programs designed to reintegrate veterans into civilian industry. Mass production made household technology more affordable, changing daily life for millions of families. The same companies that once turned steel into bombers now turned it into washing machines. The same engineers who once designed radar systems now designed home electronics. The same assembly lines that once built tanks now built cars for a booming consumer economy. But the industrial structure that had proven capable of producing war at massive scale never disappeared. It remained in place, capable of being reactivated whenever global conflict demanded it. America had not just won a war, it had demonstrated an ability to mobilize industry faster and more completely than any nation in history. World War II was not decided only on beaches and battlefields. It was decided in factories, power plants, chemical labs, and machine shops by companies and workers whose products never carried military markings, but whose output shaped the fate of nations. For many families, the war effort was not something that happened somewhere else. It happened at kitchen tables, where ration books were kept, at bus stops where night shift workers waited in the dark, and in factories where people continued production quotas instead of days on the calendar. Children grew up watching parents leave before sunrise and return after dark, knowing that the work being done inside those massive buildings mattered in ways they were too young to fully understand. When victory finally came, there was relief, but also exhaustion. Entire generations had spent years measuring their lives by output, by shifts, and by shortages. The consumer boom that followed often gets remembered as sudden prosperity. But it was built on a population that had already learned how to sacrifice, cooperate, and endure long before peace returned. The war was fought overseas, but it was powered at home.
There are over 1,400 parts that had to be made and brought together and skillfully assembled. You're right. Nobody has to learn to put all 1,400 parts together. Each has his own job, and he knows that job almost well enough to do it blindfolded. That's the way it is in a big war plant. You've learned your job, and you're proud of it.